For decades, Rob Reiner's name represented warmth, laughter, and timeless storytelling, a filmmaker whose work shaped generations and whose personal life appeared, from the outside, to be one of rare stability in an industry known for excess and collapse. With his wife by his side for years as a quiet but constant presence, a partner who shared his values, his private world, and the long journey that fame often complicates rather than completes, and together they were seen as a Hollywood couple who had survived it all, the pressures, the temptations, the storms, living behind the gates of a peaceful Los Angeles home that symbolized safety, success, and family unity, until one unimaginable moment shattered that illusion forever and turned a story of legacy into one of horror. On a night that should have passed unnoticed like so many before it, silence filled that home not as rest, but as finality, because Rob Reiner and his wife were found dead in circumstances so violent and so unexpected that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend what they were seeing, and as the news spread, the world reacted with disbelief. Fans refusing to accept that a man who brought so much light to others could meet such a dark end, while friends, colleagues, and loved ones searched desperately for answers that did not yet exist. But the shock did not end with their deaths, because when authorities revealed who stood at the center of the investigation, the story crossed into territory few could emotionally process, as suspicion fell not on an intruder, not on a business rival, not on a stranger driven by obsession, but on their own son, Nick Reiner, a name suddenly pulled from relative obscurity into the harshest spotlight imaginable, forcing the public to confront a truth that felt almost forbidden to say out loud. That sometimes the greatest danger does not come from outside the home, but from within it. As the case moved forward, speculation exploded, fueled by fragments of information, whispers of mental illness, past struggles, family tensions, and unanswered questions that only deepened the mystery. Yet none of those theories prepared anyone for what would unfold inside the courtroom, where grief met accountability, where a broken family's private pain became public record, and where Nick Reiner, standing before the law, reportedly broke down in a way that stunned everyone present, not merely acknowledging what he had done, but offering an explanation that cut far deeper than guilt or rage and challenged everything people thought they understood about motive, love, and betrayal. This video is not just about a crime, nor is it simply about a famous name brought low, but about the slow unraveling of a family, the warning signs that were missed or misunderstood, the psychological descent that may have been unfolding in silence, and the moment when a son finally spoke words that no parent should ever have to hear attributed to their child. Words so disturbing and so emotionally complex that they left even hardened observers shaken, questioning whether this tragedy was preventable or inevitable. Stay with us until the end, because this is a story that refuses simple answers, a story where truth hides beneath layers of grief, denial, and shock, and where the admission made in court does not bring closure, but instead opens a far more unsettling question that lingers long after the final gavel falls. How does a family built on love reach a point from which there is no return? December 14th began like countless other mornings inside the Reiner home, quiet, orderly, and unremarkable, a day that carried no warning signs of the devastation waiting just hours ahead, as sunlight crept through tall windows onto framed photographs that captured decades of family history, moments of joy frozen in time, smiling faces that suggested permanence and safety, the illusion that some lives, once carefully built, are immune to collapse, yet beneath that calm exterior, something was already terribly wrong, something unseen and irreversible. As the day unfolded, unanswered calls and broken routines slowly raised concern among those closest to the household, because Rob Reiner was not a man who vanished without explanation, and his wife was not someone who ignored obligations or disappeared into silence, and when attempts to reach them failed repeatedly, worry turned into dread, the kind that tightens the chest before the mind can fully accept what it already senses, that something unthinkable has occurred. When authorities finally arrived at the Brentwood residence, the atmosphere shifted instantly from concern to shock, because what awaited inside defied logic and expectation, as officers moved carefully through a home that once symbolized comfort and stability and instead found themselves standing in the aftermath of extreme violence. A scene so disturbing it immediately erased any lingering hope of misunderstanding or medical emergency, replacing it with the grim certainty that this was no accident, no natural passing, but a deliberate and brutal act. Rob Reiner and his wife were found lifeless, their deaths marked by signs of sustained physical assault, evidence that pointed not to a moment of rage, but to an encounter that unfolded with terrifying intensity, leaving investigators stunned by both the brutality and the deeply personal nature of the crime, because violence inside a family home carries a weight that no public crime scene ever does, forcing everyone involved to confront the possibility that this tragedy was born not of random chaos, but of something far closer and far more intimate. As news began to leak, law enforcement sealed the property, neighbors gathered at a distance, and whispers spread through the community, each one adding another layer of disbelief, because no matter how many years Hollywood had witnessed scandals and downfall, this felt different, darker, more incomprehensible, the kind of story that no one wants to believe is real until it is already too late. The shift from mourning to investigation was swift and unforgiving, Because once the reality of a double homicide became undeniable, every detail of the Reiner family's private life was suddenly subject to scrutiny, as detectives began reconstructing the final hours leading up to the deaths, examining phone records, movements, conversations, and patterns that might explain how such violence could erupt without warning inside a home long associated with warmth and success. What made the case especially chilling was the absence of clear signs pointing to an outside intruder, no forced entry, no signs of theft, no evidence of a stranger fleeing into the night, and as investigators ruled out random violence, attention inevitably turned inward, toward the people who knew the home best, who understood its layout, its routines, its vulnerabilities. A realization that cast a heavy shadow over the investigation and made every discovery feel more unsettling than the last. As hours passed, authorities began piecing together a timeline that raised deeply uncomfortable questions, because certain actions suggested familiarity rather than chaos, intent rather than panic, and while investigators remained cautious, the direction of the case grew increasingly clear, leading them toward a conclusion that many found impossible to accept, that the threat may not have come from beyond the walls of the home, but from someone who had once been embraced within them. When the name Nick Reiner entered the investigation, the shock intensified dramatically, because the idea that a son could be connected to such violence against his own parents shattered every remaining sense of emotional distance, transforming the story from a tragic crime into a deeply personal nightmare, one that forced the public to confront the darkest questions imaginable about family mental fracture, and the fragile boundary between love and destruction. As Nick was taken into custody, images of him circulated rapidly, his face becoming a symbol of confusion, grief, and unanswered questions, and while official statements remained limited, the silence itself spoke volumes, fueling speculation and fear, because people sensed that this was only the beginning of a story far more complex and disturbing than anyone had anticipated. A story that would soon move from the privacy of a family home into the unforgiving glare of a courtroom, where the truth, whatever it might be, would finally begin to emerge. The moment that shattered what remained of normalcy came quietly and without warning, when the younger daughter arrived at the family home expecting nothing more than another ordinary visit, unaware that she was about to walk into a scene that would alter her life forever, because as she moved through familiar spaces filled with memories of laughter, shared meals, and conversations that once felt permanent, she sensed almost immediately that something was wrong, an absence that pressed heavily against the air, a silence that did not feel peaceful but final, and as she followed that instinct deeper into the house, the reality revealed itself in a way no one is ever prepared for, confronting her with a sight so devastating that time itself seemed to stop, leaving her frozen between disbelief and terror. In those first moments, shock overtook comprehension, because the mind refuses to accept what the eyes are seeing, especially when the figures before you are the parents who shaped your entire existence, and yet the truth was unavoidable, forcing her to react not as a daughter but as a witness to a tragedy beyond imagination, summoning the strength to raise the alarm, to call for help, to speak words that felt impossible to say out loud, knowing that once spoken, nothing would ever be the same again. Emergency responders arrived to a scene already marked by irreversible loss, their movements careful, their expressions grim, because even for professionals accustomed to tragedy, the emotional weight of what they encountered was undeniable, a family destroyed not by accident or illness, but by an act of violence so intimate it left a permanent scar on everyone involved, and as authorities took control of the home, the daughter was ushered away, her role shifting instantly from family member to survivor, carrying a burden that would follow her long after the house itself was sealed and silenced. News of the discovery spread rapidly through official channels and then beyond them, transforming private grief into public shock, as the world learned that the lives of Rob Reiner and his wife had ended not in quiet dignity, but in a manner that defied every assumption people held about safety, success, and family bonds, leaving behind a question that echoed louder with every passing hour: who could have done this and why? As investigators worked relentlessly to reconstruct the final hours before the deaths, evidence began to point in a direction few were emotionally prepared to accept, because there were no signs of forced entry, no clear indication of an outside attacker, and no explanation that fit comfortably within the boundaries of logic, forcing authorities to consider a possibility that felt almost unspeakable, that the answers lay not beyond the family, but within it, a realization that shifted the entire tone of the investigation from tragic mystery to something far more disturbing. Within hours, attention turned to Nick Reiner, a name that until that moment carried little public weight, but now became inseparable from the unfolding case, as law enforcement tracked his movements and located him near the USC area, where he was taken into custody without incident, a development that sent shockwaves through both the investigation and the public consciousness, because the idea that a son could be connected to the violent deaths of his own parents shattered every remaining illusion of emotional distance. Images of the arrest circulated quickly, each one sparking disbelief, confusion, and outrage, as people struggled to reconcile the face of a man in custody with the legacy of the parents he was accused of losing in the most unimaginable way, and while authorities remained careful with their words, the gravity of the moment was unmistakable, because this was no longer a story unfolding behind closed doors, but a case that would soon move into the courtroom, where grief, accountability, and truth would collide under the harsh scrutiny of the law. As Nick was processed and held, questions multiplied faster than answers, with the public grasping for explanations that might make sense of the senseless, while those closest to the family faced a reality so painful it defied language, because the arrest marked not just the beginning of a legal process, but the point at which the Reiner family's private tragedy became a permanent part of public history, setting the stage for a courtroom confrontation that would force everyone to confront the darkest questions imaginable about mental fracture, responsibility, and the fragile line between love and destruction. To understand how this story reached such a devastating point, one must look beyond the crime itself and into the life of Nick Reiner, a man born into privilege, visibility, and expectation, yet shaped just as much by internal struggle as by the famous last name that followed him everywhere. Because from an early age, Nick lived in the shadow of a father celebrated worldwide for his creative brilliance. A shadow that brought access and opportunity, but also an unspoken pressure to measure up to. A legacy that few could ever fully escape. Growing up in a world where cameras, premieres, and industry conversations were normal, Nick was exposed early to both the rewards and the distortions of fame, learning quickly that admiration from strangers does not always translate into personal stability, and while outwardly he appeared to have every advantage, those closest to him later described a young man who often felt disconnected, restless, and internally conflicted, struggling to find an identity that existed independently of the Reiner name. As he moved into adulthood, those struggles intensified, manifesting in battles with addiction that pushed him further from the life many assumed he lived, leading to periods of instability that included strained family relationships, financial dependence, and even moments of homelessness that shocked those who believed wealth insulated families from such realities. Yet for Nick, those experiences were not contradictions but symptoms of a deeper internal collapse that had been unfolding for years. In moments of clarity, Nick attempted to channel his pain into creative expression, most notably through a semi-autobiographical film project that explored addiction, recovery, and self-destruction, a work that many later revisited with unease, interpreting it as both a confession and a warning, a glimpse into a mind wrestling openly with demons it could not fully defeat, even as it sought understanding through art. Behind closed doors, the situation grew more fragile, with family members reportedly alternating between concern, hope, and fear as Nick's behavior became increasingly unpredictable, marked by emotional volatility, paranoia, and periods of withdrawal that raised alarm but offered no clear solutions, because mental illness does not announce itself neatly, nor does it follow a predictable path. And those who tried to help often found themselves trapped between compassion and helplessness. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, that instability appeared to accelerate, as Nick's mental state reportedly deteriorated further, compounded by changes in medication, erratic sleep patterns, and moments of behavior that left friends and relatives deeply unsettled, including incidents at social gatherings where his words and actions suggested a mind struggling to maintain control, a warning sign that, in hindsight, felt painfully clear but at the time remained terrifyingly ambiguous. What makes this part of the story so haunting is not just the presence of mental illness or addiction, but the realization that suffering can exist quietly within families that appear outwardly functional, loving, and successful, because Nick Reiner was not a stranger to care or concern, nor was he abandoned by those around him, yet despite resources, support, and repeated attempts to intervene, his internal reality continued to fracture, moving steadily toward a breaking point no one could clearly see until it was already too late. By the time the world learned his name, it was no longer as a son, a writer, or a man fighting personal demons, but as the central figure in an unimaginable tragedy, forcing the public to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth, that understanding who Nick Reiner was does not offer easy answers, but instead exposes the terrifying complexity of a mind unraveling in silence, setting the stage for the courtroom moment when all of that hidden turmoil would finally erupt into words that shocked everyone who heard them. The first time Nick Reiner appeared in court, the room felt heavier than silence itself, because this was not merely a legal proceeding but the moment when private devastation became public reckoning, and as he was led into the courtroom under close supervision, wearing protective clothing meant to prevent self-harm, the contrast between the gravity of the charges and the fragility of the man standing before the judge was impossible to ignore. His posture rigid, his eyes unfocused, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and resignation, as if the full weight of what had happened still had not settled into a reality he could comprehend. Observers noted how different he looked from the images that once circulated quietly in creative circles, because the courtroom stripped away identity, status, and background, leaving only a defendant accused of the most unthinkable crime imaginable, and as the charges were read aloud, 2 counts of murder spoken in a calm, procedural tone, the words echoed through the room with a brutality of their own, each syllable sealing the fact that this was no misunderstanding, no temporary nightmare, but the beginning of a legal battle that would define the rest of his life. The judge's decision to deny bail landed with quiet finality, reinforcing the seriousness of the case and ensuring that Nick would remain in custody as the proceedings moved forward. And while the courtroom remained outwardly controlled, the emotional undercurrent was unmistakable, because behind every legal formality was the unspoken reality that 2 lives had been lost, a family had been destroyed, and a son now stood accused of erasing the very people who brought him into the world. As the legal process advanced, attention turned to the defense team tasked with confronting a case that defied simplicity, because this was not a matter of clear motive or calculated gain, but a tangled intersection of mental illness, family history, and psychological collapse, forcing attorneys to examine not only what happened, but whether Nick Reiner was capable of fully understanding his actions at the time they occurred. Behind closed doors, evaluations began, records were reviewed, and a narrative slowly took shape that focused less on intent and more on deterioration, chronicling years of instability, substance abuse, and escalating psychological distress that painted a picture of a man losing his grip on reality long before the night of violence. And while prosecutors focused on the evidence of the act itself, the defense prepared to argue that the mind responsible for those actions was not operating within the boundaries of rational control. This approach did not come without controversy, because invoking mental illness in cases of extreme violence often divides public opinion sharply, raising uncomfortable questions about accountability, compassion, and justice. Yet for the defense, the goal was not absolution but explanation, an attempt to show that the events were not driven by hatred or malice, but by a fractured perception of reality in which fear, delusion, and emotional chaos overwhelmed any remaining sense of judgment. As experts were consulted and reports compiled, one reality became increasingly clear to everyone involved, that whatever path this case followed, it would force the courtroom to confront not only the crime itself, but the broader and deeply unsettling issue of how society recognizes, treats, and responds to severe mental illness before it reaches a catastrophic breaking point. The moment that would define the case came not through aggressive questioning or dramatic evidence, but through silence, because when Nick Reiner was finally given the opportunity to speak, the courtroom expected rehearsed statements or guarded answers, not the raw unraveling that followed, as his composure collapsed under the weight of accumulated grief, fear, and psychological exhaustion, his voice faltering as he struggled to articulate thoughts that had clearly haunted him long before the trial began. What emerged was not a calculated confession, but an emotional implosion, as Nick spoke of a distorted reality he claimed had overtaken his mind, describing a growing belief that his parents were no longer who he thought they were, that they had become figures in a perceived threat he could not fully explain but felt powerless to escape. And as he spoke, the courtroom sat frozen, listening to a narrative that blurred the line between perception and delusion, forcing everyone present to confront how terrifyingly real such beliefs can feel to the person experiencing them. He did not speak with anger nor with defiance, but with a broken certainty that he had been acting under an overwhelming sense of fear and confusion, insisting that in his mind at the time, what he did felt like survival rather than violence, a statement that sent a visible ripple through the room, because it challenged conventional ideas of motive and intention, replacing them with a far more disturbing possibility, that this tragedy was born not of hatred, but of a mind trapped in a reality that no longer aligned with the world around it. As his words trailed off and he was guided back into silence, the courtroom remained still, not because answers had been found, but because the admission left behind questions that were far more unsettling than anyone anticipated, questions about responsibility, prevention, and the terrifying consequences of untreated or misunderstood mental illness, ensuring that long after the proceedings ended for the day, the echo of what Nick Reiner said would continue to haunt everyone who heard it. In the days following the courtroom revelations, the reaction unfolded like a wave that refused to settle, spreading across Hollywood's social media and living rooms around the world, because the tragedy did not remain confined to legal documents or closed proceedings, but spilled outward into public consciousness, where grief, disbelief, anger, and sorrow collided in real time, as actors, directors, writers, and longtime collaborators shared tributes that spoke not only of Rob Reiner's creative genius, but of his kindness, mentorship, and unwavering belief in storytelling as a force for humanity, while others struggled to reconcile those memories with the violence now attached to his name, creating a painful divide between honoring a legacy and confronting an unthinkable reality. Online, the conversation grew louder and more chaotic, as sympathy for the victims clashed with arguments about accountability, mental illness, and responsibility, turning comment sections into battlegrounds of emotion where compassion and condemnation existed side by side, some voices insisting that the story was a warning about untreated psychological suffering, others arguing that explanation should never be confused with excuse, and many simply expressing shock that a family so publicly admired could fracture in such a catastrophic way, revealing how deeply this case had unsettled people far beyond the confines of the courtroom. Amid the noise, the remaining members of the Reiner family retreated into silence, eventually releasing a brief statement that carried the weight of unbearable loss, speaking of profound grief, of parents remembered not for the manner of their deaths but for the love they gave, and of a request for privacy as they attempted to process a trauma that had permanently altered their lives. A reminder that while the public consumed the story as narrative and spectacle, for those closest to it, this was not a documentary but a reality they would carry forever. As memorial plans were quietly discussed and tributes continued to surface, the legacy of Rob Reiner and his wife took on a complicated duality, because their lives could not be reduced to the violence that ended them, nor could that violence be ignored in telling their story, forcing a reckoning with how legacies are remembered when brilliance and tragedy become inseparably linked, and how love, activism, creativity, and family devotion can coexist with endings so dark they defy comprehension. In the end, the aftermath of this case did not deliver resolution, but reflection, leaving behind a collective unease about how well we truly know the people we admire, how fragile even the strongest families can be, and how easily warning signs can be lost beneath the surface of success, ensuring that long after the headlines fade and the courtroom empties, the questions raised by this tragedy will continue to linger, unanswered, uncomfortable, and impossible to forget. If you found this video compelling and want to stay updated on real-life crime stories and shocking revelations from famous families, make sure to like this video and hit the subscribe button to join our community of viewers who are fascinated by the untold stories behind the headlines. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode that dives deep into mysteries, shocking court cases, and the private lives of people the world thought it knew. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your reactions and theories about what truly drives people to commit acts no one could imagine. Every like, comment, and subscription helps us bring more in-depth, shocking, and cinematic stories directly to you. So stay tuned for our next documentary that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew.